Shh. Mabel, keep them young'uns quiet. Keep them young'uns quiet. Here they come. Here they come. Everybody, keep still. Look to the right. I see them hiding behind the trees on the right. Keep an eye on them while I circle around behind them. Keep them covered. Keep them covered.
Hello there, Mr. Levi.
Sheriff, how can I help you, sir?
How you doing today, sir?
Fine, sir. Now, who are these gentlemen?
These gentlemen are from Alabama, bounty hunters, and they're looking for some runaways that were spotted on your property earlier and tracked them all the way up from Mobile.
You boys came from Alabama all the way up to New York
Yes, we
tracking
did.
the runaways.
Track them right to this property.
Now if you don't mind, Mr. Levi, these gentlemen would like to search your property.
Sure, gentlemen. Have a look around if you'd like. I will accompany you.
Well, Sheriff, we got him. He's okay. We're taking you back.
Take me. Let them go. Take me.
July 4th, 1776. Our forefathers signed the Declaration of Independence, stating life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What about me? I came to this country in 1565. That's 211 years before the Declaration of Independence was signed. I was in bondage. From 1565 to 1865, that's 300 years until President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. What about me? What about me?
My name is Michaela Green, and I'm going to tell you what I know about the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was how the slaves would escape and go north. There were a series of safe houses that would take them from place to place, or that they could stay at to get food and sleep for nights, and they were owned by station masters. Like Frederick Douglass was a station master, and they're also conductors that would take them where they would go from house to house. Harry Tubman was one of those.
My name is Rhea Thompson, and this is what I do and do not know about the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad was a series of an escape route for runaway slaves to get to freedom. People like Harriet Tubman would help them escape from the south to the north so they could be free. So they would go to houses and people would invite them in and hide them from people trying to get them back to the south or kill them. They would hide them in their houses or sheds and help them get farther to the north. They were white abolitionists, and what I don't know is where exactly they went to get to freedom, and I don't know what states were free and what states weren't free at the time.
As one searches through the early history of the United States, it becomes clear that the use of indentured servants, and particularly slaves from the African continent, were the cause of numerous actions, decisions, laws, and countless acts of resistance during the formative years of the Republic. The use of slavery in the southern states to support and sustain the mainly agricultural economy of these states led to the creation of secret networks that assisted slaves in their quest for freedom. Rising tensions between supporters of slavery and committed abolitionists eventually led to a terrible civil war. These initial efforts by slaves to seek their freedom were mostly daring individual actions by slaves and those persons who secretly assisted them. These activities eventually evolved into a relatively well-organized operations with station masters, conductors, safe houses, churches, and many dedicated supporters. This operation became known as the Underground Railroad. Search the history of the United States' formative years and one finds numerous laws, legal cases, and court decisions pertaining to white indentured servants and particularly black slaves from the African continent. You'll also find evidence of countless acts of resistance to them. Of course, conflicts over such laws and legal cases as the Missouri Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision eventually led our country into a terrible civil war. The mainly agricultural economy of the southern states depended on slave labor, but many of the enslaved people sought their freedom from bondage. Initially, daring individuals among the enslaved made harrowing escapes on their own, but secret networks created by the slaves themselves and people who were willing to help them in their quest for freedom developed. With many dedicated supporters in the growing abolitionist movement, the Underground Railroad evolved into a relatively well-organized operation with station masters, conductors, safe houses, and churches on numerous routes leading to Canada. There are many stories about the Underground Railroad, and they provide an interesting epic of high drama, moral courage, religious inspiration, and unexpected personal transformations played out by a cast of extraordinary individuals. These individuals seemed at the same time to be both startlingly modern and peculiarly archaic, combining then radical ideas about race and political action with traditional notions of personal honor and sacred duty. The Underground Railroad consisted of numerous routes throughout most of the current northeastern and midwestern states. Because we reside in the Rochester, New York metropolitan area, we will concentrate on the historical role it had in the network. As we recount the remarkable stories of slaves making their way to Canada and freedom, we will tell you about Rochester's most famous and prominent station master, Frederick Douglass, his residences, and the locations of other prominent safe houses and their owners in upstate New York. Before the 1830s, the Underground Railroad was not organized. Runaway slaves most likely relied on information they had heard about by word of mouth to plan their routes of escape. They would go to a house or location they had heard about from others. Sometimes the consequences would be good, other times not so good. Keep in mind that there was a constant fear of being prosecuted because of laws punishing those assisting fugitive slaves. As a result, there is little or no written documentation of these early efforts. The Underground Railroad began operating in earnest in 1830s in Rochester and most upstate New York counties. The Underground Railroad also developed a set of names for its participants. These names were based on metaphors for an actual railway system that carried passengers. An agent was anyone who worked in any manner to help slaves escape. Fugitive slaves were said to be housed temporarily in stations. The owner of a station was often called the station master. Those persons who often accompanied the fugitive slaves to the next station were identified as guides or conductors. Escaped slaves were referred to as passengers or cargo. Slaves would obtain a ticket when they used the railroad. The larger Underground Railroad organizations often had presidents or managers. These managers were often called coordinators,
and their principal function was to maintain communication links between various stations. Individuals who contributed money for food, clothing, and frequently arranged transportation for fugitive slaves were often called stockholders. It should be noted that the participants often could be classified as performing one or all of these functions at any given time. Their ultimate goal was always to do everything that they could to assist escaped slaves in reaching freedom. Both black and white people managed the railroad, as well as people of different religious denominations. Two Quakers, Isaac and Amy Post, probably helped the greatest number of runaway slaves within the city of Rochester, New York. The Posts most likely closely followed by the Presbyterians Samuel D. Porter and his sister Maria in the number of slaves that they assisted in their quest for freedom. Certain members of one of Rochester's founding families, the Fitzhughs, were involved in helping the cause both financially and politically. Elizabeth Potts married James G. Birney, and he became the Liberty Party candidate for president in both 1840 and 1844. The Liberty Party was well established in upstate counties and counted among its many prominent members abolitionists such as Dr. Hiram Corliss, Mr. William H. Mowry, Mr. John T. Masters, and Mr. Henry Holmes. The Liberty Party was a strong and stalwart supporter of slaves in gaining their freedom after a lifetime of bondage. Albany, New York, and the surrounding counties were the locations in which these men and their supporters resided, and was obviously hotbeds of anti-slavery activity because of the presence of the abolitionists. The Rochester area was a vital hub on the Underground Railroad. A major route ran from Syracuse through Rochester to Buffalo and on to St. Catharines and other Canadian cities. Activity increased greatly after the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 was passed. Many Underground Railroad routes came up from the southern tier to Rochester. The escaped slaves either went to Canada via ship from Charlotte or went westward to Buffalo and subsequently to Canada. Putneyville was another active site in the area for embarking slaves onto ships for passage to Canada. Arch Merrill describes Rochester's role in the Underground Railroad in his book, The Underground Railroad, Freedom Road, and Other Upstate Tales, because it was a port on Lake Ontario and because it was the home of Frederick Douglass. The station master of a busy underground station, Rochester was a key center on the rail-less railroad. In the 1850s, an estimated 150 slaves per year passed through Rochester via several routes or trails on the Underground Railroad. A favored trail was from Canandaigua via Mendon and the present Clover Street. Others came through Pittsford, and many traveled the Henrietta Road from East Avon and other points. Emerson Cleaves offers significant details about 8 routes and various trunk lines in his book entitled Underground Railroad Tales, with routes through the Finger Lakes region, published in 1997. In this presentation, we will list and describe additional details about some of these probable routes and relevant information about the stops on the Underground Railroad. An abbreviated listing is now presented with some brief comments about each of them. Route 1, east to west along current routes 5 and 20 from Syracuse to Rochester. Route 2, east to west along Route Oswego via Elmira to Bath. Route 3, south to north from Bath via Naples and Honeoye to Rochester. Route 4, south to north from Bath via Naples, Canandaigua, and Palmyra to Putneyville. Route 5, south to north from Bath via Branchport and Penn Yan to Geneva and routes 5 and 20. Route 6, south to north from Elmira via Ithaca and Watkins Glen to Geneva and routes 5 and 20. Route 7, south to north from Elmira via Ithaca, Auburn, Skaneateles, and Syracuse to Oswego. Route 8, south to north from Elmira via Ithaca, Cortland, and Syracuse to Oswego. We will now provide additional details about stations on some of the routes. Our intent is to focus on those routes that led to Rochester, Putneyville, and Oswego. Let us first explore the stations on Route 1. Some of them were frequent stops for slaves, and interesting tidbits of information have been discovered about each of them. 10 significant stations have been identified as being on this major route. It starts in Syracuse and ends near Rochester at the Warren Homestead. Station 1 on Route 1 was located in Syracuse at 304 East Onondaga Street, which overlooks Columbus Circle. It is currently identified as the Wesleyan Methodist Church. This is one of the last Underground Railroad stations remaining in Syracuse. 7 sculptures were carved into clay in the wall of the 50-foot basement of the church. It's speculated that they were carved by slaves that were hidden in the church. Only one of the 7 unfired clay faces remains in its original form. An archaeological team from Syracuse University speculates that it is the face composite of 2 people. They feel that it could be abolitionist leaders Frederick Douglass, who spoke at the church, and the Reverend Jermaine Logan of Syracuse. Reverend Logan was the pastor of the church. Station 2 on Route 1 has been identified as 98 West Genesee Street in Skaneateles. This location is known as the Evergreen House. This is the only verifiable Underground Railroad station still standing in Skaneateles. The house was built by James Canning Fuller. He was a Quaker who arrived in Skaneateles from England on April 20th, 1834. Fuller and his wife were strong abolitionists and often traveled south to buy slaves. They released them after they arrived back in the North. After dark every evening, he would check both ends of the street and put the slaves in a hay-covered wagon and move them to the next station on Route 1. Station 3 on Route 1 was in Auburn at 33 South Street. The location is known as the Seward Mansion. The mansion was built in 1816 to 1817 by Judge Eliza Miller. He was William Seward's father-in-law. It is located on the National Register of Historic Places. It was expanded in both 1847 and 1860 to a total of 30 rooms. Fugitive slaves who arrived at the Seward Mansion stayed in 2 rooms, one large room and another smaller room on the second floor in the back of the mansion was a resting place for the fugitive slaves.
Station 3A on Route 1 has been identified as 180 South Street in Auburn, New York. This location is known as the Harriet Tubman House. Harriet Tubman was born around 1820 on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. She had become a revered person in the anti-slavery literature because of her numerous trips to the southern states to help escort slaves seeking freedom in the northern states and Canada. Harriet Tubman lived in St. Catharines, Canada from 1851 to 1857. Tubman moved to Auburn, New York in 1859, buying her home and a small slice of land for $1,200 from then U.S. Senator William Seward. She stayed in the Finger Lake City until her death in 1913. Harriet Tubman is buried in Auburn Fort Hill Cemetery, about a mile from her house. Although the initial house that she lived in is gone, the site is now a National Historical Site and is a U.S. Historical Park in Auburn and Fleming, New York. In compromise, these properties, the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged and Indigent Negroes in Auburn, nearby Tubman residence, and the Thompson AME Zion Church in Auburn.
Station 4 on Route 1 has been identified as 2531 Lower Lake Road in Seneca Falls. The cobblestone of Ferry Farm faces Cayuga Lake. The land trail of slaves to Canada was broken by bringing them across the lake from Union Springs. Union Springs was a village of ardent Quaker abolitionists. This was also the landing place for an Indian canoe ferry and the first white man's ferry. It has a New York historical marker that identifies it as a station on the Underground Railroad. Station 5 on Route 1 was located in Geneva at 20 Pulteney Street. When a two-story frame house with a one-story addition on its south side was remodeled years ago, a bullet was found in the front door. An often recounted story relates that men chasing an escaped slave fired a shot through the front door. Just before they arrived, Grandmother Van Houten, a spirited woman and a devout Methodist, heard shouting and saw an African American running up the sidewalk toward the house. She let the escaped slave in and bolted the door. She quickly gave him part of a loaf of bread, guided him out of the back door, and told him to rattle the back fence to let her know that he had gotten away. She opened the door to the boisterous men and invited them to search her home. While they were searching the second floor, she heard the back fence being rattled. Station 6 on Route 1 at 3402 West Lake in Canandaigua. This home was built by Isaac Parrish in 1837 and was known as the Cobblestone Farm. The beautiful two-story cobblestone house was a station on the Underground Railroad when owned by Isaac Parrish. It was later purchased by Robert and Maggie Gordon Benedict in 1858. They maintained its status as a location on the Underground Railroad. Escaped slaves were transported to the Cobblestone Farm from Naples, New York, by William Uncle Billy Marks, Jr. in one of his mortuary horse-drawn hearses. The fleeing slaves were hidden in a secret room in the attic where they walked on loose floorboards around the south chimney through a doorway into a small room. This room was 6 feet wide and 10 feet long. The ceiling was 5 feet 4 inches high at its peak and gradually sloped down to 4 feet. The back wall was constructed of stone and mortar, and the other walls of plaster. The room would have been stifling hot in the summer and bitter cold in the winter. It had no windows. Although this location has not been authenticated by an historical organization, it has been identified in numerous written references. Station 7 on Route 1 was in Canandaigua at 104 Gibson Street. This was an Underground Railroad station on routes to both Rochester and Putneyville. Most of the slaves arrived from either Naples or Geneva. A prominent tale was told frequently about the arrival of slave catchers. It is said that when there was an emergency, slaves descended through a trapdoor in the dining room to a dry cistern in the basement of the house. Station 8 on Route 1 has been identified as 173 Mason Road in Parrington. This is a large, sprawling, two-story frame house that was built in 1816 by Gilbert Ramsell. He was a Quaker and an abbot abolitionist. He had moved from New England with his father as a young man. He taught school in Macedon and saved his money to build a house to replace the family's log cabin, which was the first structure on the property. Ramsdell built a larger house for his bride, Harriet Smith, who joined the Society of Friends when they were married. Large boulders were used to construct the cellar walls. Lumber cut on the site was used to build the house, and it was held together by wrought iron nails. It had high ceilings in its many rooms. The home was so large and so unusual that it was often called Ramsdell's Castle.
Yeah, so I've only actually owned this for a couple of weeks now, but the people that sold it to me gave me one of the Parrington Fairport history books, and that was the first I knew that I'd purchased a property that was part of the Underground Railroad, so it was pretty cool. It's actually Ramsdell's Castle, I think is what it says in the book that I received. But and then this area that you're shooting right now, I didn't actually know this was here. Just climbed this ladder to see how to get up here, and I don't know if there's any relevance to this space or not. I'm assuming they probably hid people up in this loft and in here, but yeah, it's cool little piece of history.
Station 9 on Route 1 was also located in Parrington at 2187 East Whitney Road. The two-story frame house, known as the Talman House, was used by John Talman Sr. as a station on the Underground Railroad. His son, John Jr., presented a paper to a local historical society in which he commented, "In 1859-60, a runaway slave from Georgia, his wife, and a half-dozen children were concealed in our house for a week on their way to Canada. They were quartered in the kitchen and provided with food, sufficient for several days. My father, in the dead of night, packed the family in a lumber wagon under quilts and blankets and drove them to the next station. The next station was in Rochester, leading to either a boat across Lake Ontario to Canada or west from Rochester to Buffalo and then to St. Catharines, Ontario. There are some references that mention that Mr. Talman also transported runaways in his lumber wagon at night to other stations in Putnamville or Charlotte. This station of the historic Underground Railroad has been identified in multiple written references but not verified by an historical organization. Additional routes and their alternates were also described as follows. One route to Rochester from Canandaigua through Victor, Parrington, and Pittsford. Another route went through East Bloomfield, Ionia, Mendon, Henrietta, and Brighton. A third route proceeded west from Palmyra through Macedon, Egypt, and Parrington. Station 10 on Route 1 has been identified as 1956 West Henrietta Road in the town of Brighton, New York. The Warrant Homestead replaced a log cabin built on the site in 1819 by Thomas Warrant. Warrant moved to Rochester in 1818 from Yarmouth, England by way of Canada. He was a coppersmith by trade and a charter member of the Rochester Anti-Slavery Society. He had to smuggle his coppersmith's tools across the U.S.-Canadian border because of existing laws. Warrant, a Baptist and staunch abolitionist, hid escaping slaves in his barns across the road from his L-shaped brick house and in the upper rooms at the back of his house. His barns and the back of his house were reported to have never been locked. When it was safe to move them, he often transported the slaves under hay in his wagon to Underground Railroad stations along the shore of Lake Ontario for passage to Canada. The next route we would like to explore is Route 3. This route started in Bath and went to Abbasia, Wallace, and Cohocton to Naples and then along Honeoye Lake's West Lake Road and by Honeoye, Lima, Rush, Henrietta, and Brighton to Rochester. An extension of this Route 3 often ended in the towns of Greece and Parma and the home of the Chase family on Manitou Road. Station 1 on Route 3 has been identified as 125 Washington Street in the town of Bath. This Underground Railroad station often received slaves from Elmira, Big Flats, and the Corning area. They were hidden in a basement fruit cellar and often transported to Naples or Penn on their way north. Station 2 on Route 3 has been identified as 1 Mechanic Street in the town of Naples. The two-story main house with one-story additions on each side was once the home and funeral parlor of William Marks, Jr. He was affectionately referred to as Uncle Billy. He transported slaves in his hearses. The escaped slaves usually came to Uncle Billy's house at night via Naples Creek. He transported most of his charges to the Pitts Mansion at Honeoye. Uncle Billy is reported to have helped 600 slaves escape to Canada. Station 3 on Route 3 has been identified as 105 North Main Street in the town of Naples. Built in 1841, the Maxfield Inn is a Greek Revival home that was in the Maxfield family for 3 generations. The carriage house behind the inn was a station on the Underground Railroad. A rock-lined tunnel that was used by fugitive slaves connected the carriage house to a barn next door. Mr. Wayne Bukar is the current owner of the Maxfield Inn, and he is restoring it.
Hi, I'm Wayne Bouchard. I've been interested in history probably all my life, but I didn't really know how much until I bought this place here down in Naples about 3 years ago. This was the Maxfield Inn. It's got an extreme history, a lot of history about a lot of different things in a lot of different areas, one of which is the Underground Railroad, and so I became extremely fascinated in that. So this is our latest project down here, is restoring this Maxfield Inn, this beautiful antique building. So where I want to start really is to talk a little bit about Naples itself, Naples, New York. I mean, why it was so fundamentally involved, or critically involved, in the transfer of slaves from Pennsylvania in the South up through to Rochester. There's a lot of talk and a lot of information, a lot of stories about Frederick Douglass and what took place in the Rochester area about transferring slaves, getting them across Lake Ontario to freedom up in Toronto. But there isn't a lot of talk about what happened, how did the slaves make their way to Rochester? There's some talk about, or some stories about coming through Albany. There was a train system they could take, there were the canal, and some of the other things were there for them. But the slaves coming from northern Pennsylvania really could only go about as far as Bath and Elmira, New York. From there, there's a set of mountains. We have ski slopes here and everything else, and Naples is in the middle of all those mountains. You pretty much have to go through Naples to get to Rochester. So if you use your iPhone and they say you want to go down to Pennsylvania, it'll take you through Naples. Even Steve Jobs knows that you've really got to get through Naples to get down to the southern tier, unless you want to go around all the mountains. And so originally Naples was called Middletown, just for that reason, because it was in the middle town between Canandaigua, Rochester, and the Bath and Elmira area. So the moving of slaves up through the north critically needed to come through Naples, so there needed to be a station here. The other fundamental reason Naples is key to the Underground Railroad is that once you get through the mountains, you're pretty much stopped at Canandaigua Lake. So we've all heard stories, and they're true, about slaves were told to follow the creeks north, to keep away from the scent, to keep their scent from bloodhounds, etc. They could stay, they could follow the creeks north. So what I did was, when I started researching this, was I went on Google Earth. I started in Bath, up in the air, and I flew up the Cohocton River, Cohocton Creek from Bath, and followed the rivers as though I was a slave through the mountains. And where did it end up? It ends up in what they used to call Bloods, which is now called Atlanta, which is North Cohocton. From there, the next town north is Naples. If you then take the Naples Creek from there north, you can't go any further north because you hit the Canandaigua Lake, the south end of Canandaigua Lake. So that would be an obvious place for them to get off the creek thing and think, oh, we need to go somewhere else, but we can't swim across the lake or swim down the length of the lake to get to Rochester. There comes the story of Naples and the Underground Railroad. So what ended up happening was there was an individual here in town named Billy Marks, and he with Mr. Lyons, Mr. Thrall, and Mr. Luther pretty much owned this area. This was not actually, this area where this inn is here and where Billy Marks' house is, wasn't really Naples proper at the time. Naples proper was further north. So they pretty much owned this whole area here. It was a wooded area, and they were the ones who put in the races, they call them, which are the streams and the waterways to drive the future, which became sawmills and other mills for grinding flour and wheat and stuff. And so they put the channels in, or the waterways, they diverted the streams coming off the mountains for energy. And in so doing, they had a lot of mills right on the creek because the water would come shooting past down the mountain. They would channel it through their water mill and then right onto the creek. So the slaves would find their way up to the end of Naples Creek, right where some of these mills were that the Luthers owned near Billy Marks' property. So they had nowhere else to go. So it starts to become a logical story here. Billy Marks was an abolitionist. He heard Frederick Douglass speak in the 1850s. He was always thought slavery was wrong. He was a very religious man, very quiet, very reserved individual, very strong-willed. And so he actually got to the point where he invited Frederick Douglass to Naples to speak. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The other really interesting thing about Naples is this town was founded by a whole bunch of Revolutionary and War of 1812 colonels. So they were very patriotic. They're so patriotic that there's a stone up in the northern part of Naples, which was the old Naples, where it talks about George Washington putting his first army together here in Naples. When George Washington died, the people who sung at his funeral were Naples choir. The priest or the pastor who gave the sermon was the Naples sermon. So George Washington was connected with a lot of the colonels down here. They're very patriotic. And the reason I bring that up is that when Billy Marks started to talk about abolition, being an abolitionist, started talking about how wrong it was to keep slaves, this town thought he was being unpatriotic because that was not considered patriotic, because the way the country ran at that point was slavery was embedded in the culture. So actually, there was a bunch of people from Naples got together with Billy Marks and met, and it was their first abolitionist movement. And the town actually pulled together the cannons and the guns and shot over their heads to break it up because it was considered unpatriotic. But as time went on, obviously people's hearts softened. People like Frederick Douglass played a huge role in what went on in Rochester because Billy used to bring people from Naples up to Rochester to hear them talk. And it's slowly people's hearts softened here. They realized, wow, this slavery thing isn't really that good. It's not the way it should be. And Naples really started to embrace the whole abolitionist movement. Billy Marks built a Methodist church down the street here with his own hands. And that's where a lot of what they used to call it the old line. And a lot of the work that was done in the planning, coordination, and receiving of funds to help the slaves move north took place through that church. I have a diary of a young man, Sumner Luther, that lived in this house. This was originally the Luther's house. And he talks about going to the old line, little symbols in his diary of having to spend all night preparing, and it's throughout that diary. So there's evidence of what went on here. So Billy Marks was definitely an abolitionist. He actually invited Frederick Douglass down on multiple occasions. In one case, he actually couldn't find the place in the town, from the townspeople to actually put him up to give a talk. So he built a platform in front of his house here and literally had Frederick Douglass give a talk. And again, to soften the hearts of the people in Naples, who then actually really supported the abolitionist movement, sent over 200 troops to the Civil War, and in the 1860s and 70s wrote about how proud they were that they freed 4,000 slaves, that they started out a little rough with that first abolitionist movement, but obviously they moved toward really helping out in the end, and that's what the story's about. So I've been researching this because I bought this old house. It's built in the 1830s. My wife and I have been restoring it. We've been finding information about it. It is listed as one of the potential Underground Railroad stations. There's a tunnel or cistern underneath the carriage house in the back. There's trapdoors in the hall and the floors that today don't lead to other homes, but in the 60s they did, we're told, by people locally here. And that there were some people getting trapped or kids trapped in them, and they kind of sealed some of them up. So there's fragments of tunnels and things under the streets here. But the main story, really, that's documented and well documented in the newspapers, because one thing Naples did was they had 3 newspapers that were competing, and they would publish once or twice a week. And so those newspapers really had to find things to write about. And so after the Civil War, they put together all kinds of articles about the abolitionist work of Billy Marks. And so a lot of that's documented and it's in the newspapers. And a lot of this really wasn't able to come out until full text search. These newspapers now have been all scanned in, have been made into PDF and full text searchable, so I can search in on keywords like slave or LAVE, because the S didn't do so well in the translation, and be able to find articles, actual articles about the history of what took place here. And I've done that and combined those into a report. Back to Billy Marks. So Billy Marks was somebody, again, very, very strong individual, very tough-minded about what he thought was right and wrong. He didn't just listen to what the crowd said. He did his best to move forward. He brought a group of Naples people to Buffalo for the Free Soil Act, which I read about, didn't know what it was, but found out that when the southern states, Texas, joined the Union, they were not slave states at that time, and there was a whole group of people that tried to stop them from becoming slave states. They came to the Union and added to the United States, but they didn't want them to become slave states. So those free soil meetings were held in Buffalo, and Billy Marks brought a group of Naples people, the same people, to Buffalo. They walked through the streets with torches. There was a whole big rebellion about, or at least it was peaceful, but it was about making sure that these provinces, these areas of Texas and the lower United States were not converted to slave states, since they weren't at that time when they first joined the Union.
Station 4 on Route 3 has been identified as the Pitts Mansion or Homestead on Route 20A in the Honeyard, a town of Richmond in Ontario County. The Pitts Homestead is a 2-story colonial house that was built in 1821 by Gideon Pitts, the son of Captain Peter Pitts, the first settler in the area of the village of Honeyard. Gideon Pitts Jr. was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Escaped slaves were supposedly hidden in an unfinished cistern in the basement that never held water. The basement has 5 rooms, one of which is a walled-off room that may have contained the cistern. It is rumored that a tunnel used by the slaves ran from the basement to a barn behind the house. The tunnel is no longer visible. Helliam Pitts The daughter of Gideon Pitts was the second wife of Frederick Douglass, the prominent editor and abolitionist. The mixed marriage caused a significant stir in 1884. Douglass responded to the critics with this comment: "My first wife was the color of my mother, and my second wife was the color of my father." Helen's viewpoint was, "Love came to me, and I was not afraid to marry the man I loved because of his color." Station 5 on Route 3 has been identified as 52 South Main Street in the town of Pittsford. The Hargis Briggs House is a stately brick mansion with 4 chimneys. It was built by Augustus Elliot for his fiancée. She never lived in the house. Judge Ashley Sampson, an ardent abolitionist, lived in the house in the 1820s and was a station master on the Underground Railroad. The house is named for Sally Hargis, a New York socialite, who lived in the house after Judge Sampson moved to Brooks Avenue in Rochester. Frequently repeated stories that an underground cavern existed under the village of Pittsford that was connected to the Phoenix Building and the Hargis House and other stations on the Underground Railroad has never been verified. If the tunnels ever did exist, they have been filled in and are not there today. Some historical organizations have authenticated this site. Station 6 on Route 3 has been identified as 1496 Clover Street in the town of Brighton. This home was built in the 1820s by Isaac Moore. He was an ardent abolitionist and was married to a relative of William Clout Bloss. Mr. Bloss was a leader in the abolitionist movement in the city of Rochester. The house is a stately 2-story brick mansion and is called the Babcock House because 3 generations of the Babcock family lived there from the early 1860s until 1944. Station 7 on Route 3 has been identified as 1191 Manitou Road in the town of Greece, which is near Route 18 and Ladder Road in the town of Parma. This 2-story cobblestone house was built in the 1830s by Isaac Chase, a retired New England sea captain and devout Quaker. The house is set back a short distance from Manitou Road and is not far from the shore of Lake Ontario, where slaves boarded boats to be transported to Canada. Supposedly, the house had a trapdoor over a wooden stairway that led to a secret room in the basement. Chase's son Isaac Jr. was active in the Underground Railroad during the 1840s and 1850s. He transported many slaves in his wagons to Lake Ontario where they boarded boats to Canada. It should also be noted that Isaac Chase Jr. was a New York State Assemblyman and was elected Parma Town Supervisor 9 times. This station has been identified in many written references and has been authenticated by an historical organization. Route 4 proceeded from Bath through Avatka, Wallace, and Cohocton to Naples and then along Canandaigua's Lake, West Lake Road to Canandaigua. From this point, some of the refugees traveled northwest to Rochester on Route 3, and others went north via Shortville, Manchester, Palmyra, Marion, and Williamson to Pulteneyville. Station 6 on Route 4 has been identified as the Pliny Sexton House in Palmyra at 322 East Main Street. This 2-story brick house was built by Pliny Sexton, a Quaker jeweler in the 1830s. A New York State historical marker in front of the home indicates that it was used as a station on the Underground Railroad and is therefore authenticated. Sexton would hide the slaves under a load of hay or vegetables in his wagon and carry them to the next station on the Underground Railroad. They traveled north to Putneyville on the shore of the Lake Ontario or northwest via Parrington to Rochester. Pliny Jr. also helped his father with the slaves. He later became more well known than his father as a banker, lawyer, and the chancellor of the New York State Board of Regents. Station 7 on Route 4 was located in Palmyra at 101 East Main Street. This station on the Underground Railroad was the Western Presbyterian Church. It is actually located at the intersections of routes 21 and 31. Refugee slaves were supposedly hidden in the belfry of the church before being transferred at night by an underground tunnel to the Erie Canal. The next destination would either be Williamson and or Putneyville on the coast of Lake Ontario. Station 8 on Route 4 was at 5825 Route 21 in Williamson. This is a 3-story fieldstone house with walls 18 inches thick that is now covered with stucco. It was built in 1838 by Griffin Cooper, a Quaker and active abolitionist. It is located 5 miles south of Putneyville. Fugitive slaves were hidden in a secret chamber in the attic. In the 1950s, David Oakleaf, whose parents owned the house at the time, found small doors on the east and the west sides of the attic that were blocked by large boxes. Each door led to a triangular space formed by the root line. David crawled along the passageway and found a chamber that could accommodate 8 to 10 people for short periods of time. David's grandmother, Earline Oakleaf, told him a story passed down to her by her great-grandfather, Griffith Cooper, that slave catchers came to the farmhouse looking for escaped slaves. They plunged swords into a pile of hay in which they suspected escaped slaves were hidden. They left without finding any refugees. The haystack contained several African Americans, and one of them had been stabbed and severely injured. However, he didn't cry out and give away his presence and that of his friends. Although this location has been cited in numerous references, it has not been authenticated by an historical organization. Station 9 on Route 4 has been identified as 4184 Washington Street in Putneyville. The Captain Troop House is a cobblestone structure built in 1832 by Captain Horatio N. Troop. Samuel Collier was an associate of Captain Troop on the Underground Railroad. Collier's son, Lear, transported many wagon loads of fugitive slaves from Sodus and other Underground Railroad stations to his father's estate in the middle of the night. The Colliers would take their fugitive slave to Captain Troop and say, "I have some passengers for you." Captain Troop would respond, "My boat runs for passengers." One of the vessels that Captain Troop used to support escaped slaves to Canada was the Steamer Express, which was owned by a partnership company. Captain Troop commanded this vessel from 1839 to 1842. Captain Troop's brother, Captain Washington S. Troop, was also in the shipping business, but it is not certain that he helped fugitive slaves. However, their nephew, James T. Holling, who was also a lake boat captain, was active in the Underground Railroad. On one occasion, he took some escaped slaves across Lake Ontario to Presque Isle off the shoreline of Canada. The slaves were said to be so relieved to have arrived in Canada that they kneeled in prayer on obtaining their freedom. Although there is no historical marker at this location, an historical organization has authenticated it as a stop on the Underground Railroad. Station 10 on Route 4 was also in Putneyville at 7851 J Street. The Selby House is a 2-story frame house with 1-story addition at the back. It was built in 1808 by Jeremiah Selby. The lake piers directly across Washington Street from the house were the point of departure for slaves being transported to Canada by ship. The slaves were hidden temporarily behind the Selby home among large piles of wood while waiting to board Captain Troop's ship. Although there is no historical marker at this location, it is identified as a location on the Underground Railroad. Station 11 on Route 4 was the Hasselwander House at 4194 Washington Street in Putneyville, New York. The Hasselwander House is a 2-story brick home with a cupola. It was another of the Putneyville Underground Railroad stations. The slaves were hidden in a frame addition at the rear of the house. In Putneyville, escaped slaves boarded ships that were bound to Peterborough and other Ontario, Canada ports. No historical marker is present at this location, but it has been verified by a historical organization.
In this presentation, we have discussed significant facts about the Underground Railroad in upstate New York. The significant events spanning years from the early 1800s up to the end of the American Civil War. It is an effort by my partner and I to organize and make public information that we have collected over the number of years on this subject. Hopefully, It will stimulate research efforts by others in this important era in the history of New York State. Specific facts have been presented about the following areas, and hopefully they are of interest to many. Other notable facts about this study and its historical significance. Thank you for watching the documentary, and be sure to check out the separate commentaries included on this disc.
Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride.
Swing down, chariot, stop and let me
I
ride.
want you to rock me, Lord.